I think it's an interesting age, like to be a man in your mid to late 30s, because like you're kind of like
Amen.
a lot of your, the 20s is kind of like it's all potential almost, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
like in the world, like your entire life is ahead of you. You don't have, a lot of people don't have kids yet. Or maybe they're just now thinking about getting married in their mid to late 20s and that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
um, but then you get married, maybe you have a kid or two, and mid to late 30s, all of a sudden your life it doesn't give you that feeling that, oh, I've got plenty of time, right? I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, like I can do anything now, like your life is kind of more on a track, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start asking other questions. Well, what is actually meaningful about, like, what do I want to spend my time and my energy doing?
Right.
Because now you have maybe you have a wife, and maybe you have kids, and so you have less time and less energy to spend doing
Mm-hmm.
some of the things. And so you start to really ask, I think, a lot of questions about what is actually important. What do I care about?
Yeah.
What were all the things that I really wanted to do, or I thought were so important 10 years ago? Are they really that important? Like, do I need
Mm-hmm.
some of these things? Do I need like the super high powered career? Do I, those kind of
Mm-hmm.
things? Like, what really means something to you? What kind of church do you want to be a part of if you're asking those kind of questions?
Yeah. It's such
And
a different. We could talk about everything. I'm just
yeah,
looking behind you. I see Grudem systematic.
yeah. You've obviously, so this Calvin's
Yeah.
Institute, the commentaries and the institutes. I've got Aquinas, of course, over here.
Mm-hmm.
This is Bavinck. Obviously Kant, Aristotle, Nietzsche. So like Kierkegaard's up here. Um,
Yeah.
Lewis
You
scattered
are.
throughout my. What's
I
that?
think we come from similar theological worlds somewhat, and
Yeah,
you're way more
I
into
wanted to hear.
philosophy than anyone that I
Yeah,
ever came across in those
I
worlds.
I was interested to hear what you're, because I know that you're
Should we start recording?
I am recording. Yeah,
Oh,
so
dang.
we can edit however
Okay.
we want to do it. Yeah, I
All
started
right.
just because.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I did want to. So you're in the process, kind of converting to Orthodoxy. I guess, what does that look like? Because you is
Yeah.
Orthodoxy and Catholicism is not like joining a Baptist church, right? It's not like,
No.
oh, I'm Orthodox now, right? You're in the process of becoming Orthodox. Is that the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah. So there's an there. Yeah. So there's an official process. I was actually just talking to my wife about this last night. Um, because I agree with you. It's very different. Uh, it's almost more like, I don't know. I used to, right away when I first started joining the Orthodox community, they use the language of converting,
Hmm.
which to me, like my Protestant elephant, well, I would say probably my Protestant writer was. I'm just like,
Yeah.
I don't like that word. But I get it more now, and I think it's just because it really is more akin to like, it's more akin to a marriage. And I was illustrating it, so I'll tell you the process, but I was illustrating
Hmm.
it this way: is that one of the things that really bothered me about, because we've traveled a lot, and we've uh which maybe we were recording when I was giving the specifics. We can edit that out. But the so we've been a part of a lot of different churches. And not because we've left churches, and we've every place we've ever gone, we've only gone to one church, except for this last trip to Minneapolis. And something that always, and so it never really came up, but in our last, so my last foray into the evangelical Protestant world before I started becoming, like, working toward Orthodoxy, was in Minneapolis here, and we were part of this small group. And in small groups, house churches, gospel communities, whatever you want to call
Hmm.
them, they you always use the language of family. We're a family.
Right.
Um, but then the problem, so like you are a family, but the thing is like, until you're not,
Right.
like until you leave the church, and then you're no longer family. You might keep in touch with a few people. There's some friends you had along the way, but essentially, like, it's you leave the church, and like that's just the end. And I mean, part
Right.
of that's practical, part of it's understandable, but like the difference, I would say Orthodoxy is a lot more like Judaism or something. Like
Hmm.
you're always a Jew. Like you
Right.
can't, even if you don't practice, even if you we got into this a little bit on the Discord. Maybe some people will disagree because there's a new Jewish guy on there, like
Okay.
our own personal Jew on the Discord. Yeah, it's great. Uh, and uh, and he, and I was saying, like, in my mind, at least the way that I conceive of it, you can be Jewish and Christian. Um, like,
Mhm.
because Jew is big, is more of like a cultural, national identity thing. It's
Right.
not necessarily like what I profess, what I self-identify as based on my
Right. Well, and
profession.
you see, I mean, you can be a Jew and Christian. I mean, obviously, you can be Jew and atheist or agnostic,
Right,
which is like a huge percentage, but they don't
right,
consider you less Jewish by virtue
right,
of that. Yeah.
right. And Orthodoxy is a lot more like that. It is just such a, and I was trying to explain it because right now we're going through Lent. So the process to your initial question is like the official terms is you can be an inquirer, which is just someone who's coming to liturgies, involved in the community, around, interested.
Hmm.
Um, but almost like within Judaism, that would be considered like, I don't know, an interested Gentile or something that's
Hmm.
just in the outer
Okay.
perimeter. I mean, it's different because it's not like so partitioned off.
Hmm.
Um, and then there's an official thing, which actually my kids and I did just this last Sunday on Orthodoxy Sunday. But you become a catechumen, part of the catechumenate, which can be there is no time definitive part of it, but it's like it's the official entry into the process. Like, you're no longer an inquirer, you have the vision of becoming Orthodox. And that process can last a long time. There are some people who become catechumens who just, for whatever reason, take years or decades or maybe even never take
Hmm.
that next step. But it's more like you go up, it's not probably technically a sacrament, but you go up, um, and the priest, says words over you and things, crosses your heads and does all this sort of stuff. And so that's part of the official process. And then my kids, so like the plan was this Lent. Well, I won't go into all my kids are going to be baptized. I'm not going to be baptized right away. They will be baptized, which is traditionally done on Holy Saturday
Hmm.
for converts, because kids
Conversion.
are
Yeah.
baptized.
Right.
And which is, the day before Pascha, which is the Orthodox Easter. And then you're baptized. You take First Communion. It's a little different because, like, my second grader is doing First Confession too. So then you enter into all these sacraments, and then you're Orthodox.
Okay.
And that's
Gotcha.
kind of the process once you actually. But the official process is like inquirer, catechumens, and official. Like, you're in the system. The
Hmm.
priests are praying for you all the time.
Okay.
You're part of the community officially.
And is it largely the priests who decide the progression and the speed of the progression and that kind of stuff? Like how I'm assuming that, like, well, it's probably a little bit mutual, I would
Yeah.
imagine, but like I would assume the priests would also be like, yeah, you're not ready sometimes.
Yeah, I think so. It's very mutual. My experience with it has been, um like, for example, my priest, um he's perfectly comfortable and has been perfectly comfortable with me becoming Orthodox for a long time. Part of it is um part of it is an individual analysis. Like, I don't know, it's interesting talking to at least my priest, and part of this is going to be temperament, but he's a lot more like a therapist or a psychoanalysis. Like, when you go in to talk to
Hmm.
him, he just sits there and listens. Like, he'll talk and he'll say things every once in a while, but he's very, um there isn't a lot of compulsion or telling you what to do. Like,
Hmm.
there's an official way to be. So, like, if you're going to join Orthodoxy, it's not flippant and like up to you and you can do whatever you want. Like, it's very set,
Right.
but how fast you go about that is very different. Like, I don't know if you remember from Nathan Jacobs talking about this, but his wife wasn't ready to convert for a long time, and he was, and his priest basically said, no, you're not going to convert until she does. And so he waited like 7 years for his
Hmm.
wife to be ready before he converted. There's no there's I almost think of it this way: with an Orthodoxy, it's and I don't understand quite because I'm not as familiar with Catholicism, but like within Catholicism, it seems like there's their official like dogmas, doctrines, like all that stuff is on record in a more official way. Within Orthodoxy, it's more about precedent, but it's also about like there's a broad tradition and precedent, but there's also local.
Hmm.
The local and priest thing, I feel like has a little bit more autonomy
Gotcha.
within that, but yet it's a little bit more nebulous, is at least my impression of how that works. And I think practically it works the same way within Catholicism too.
Yeah, I would imagine like your local parish would like doesn't necessarily line up exactly with what the Roman
Right.
Catholic Church,
Although it's probably supposed to. Whereas,
right. Yeah,
whereas within Orthodoxy, it's more
it's
like,
not even a goal really.
I think they would say like it needs to line up, and this is where you get into fuzzy Christianese word. It needs to line up spiritually. It needs to be of the
Mhm.
same spirit,
Right.
but what that means in the particular practice
Yeah.
can vary.
Yeah. So do you not until you convert, do you not take communion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So how long has it been since you've taken communion?
Man. Well, I wouldn't even know officially because, well, and then that's the thing that's tough because our last church that we were at before this, like, I don't even know if they had a set thing. They probably did. I don't know if it was like once a month or something.
Yeah.
Um,
I feel like
and
I feel like the common thing in Protestant is either once a week, like every Sunday, or just once a month. Seems
like
to be
within the
like,
evangelical kind of fold,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, I so I've been an inquirer for over little over 2 years. So, so give or take
Okay,
that long.
gotcha.
But it's strange, like, right, because communion within Orthodoxy is, or within Catholicism, or even within Lutheranism and probably Anglicanism is different. It's not mere
Mhm.
remembrance,
Right. Yep.
and so like the the residual Protestant elephant rider is kind of just like, well, it didn't really matter then. And so like it doesn't matter. So now the way that I think about that, just to tell, like even with baptism, it's because a lot of the early church fathers, I guess, like forewent who were converts, forewent baptism till really late in their life.
Yeah, there was the Donatist sect that Augustine kind of basically killed whenever he wrote about it. But yeah, the Donatists. So what the Donatists thought was that if you got baptized and then say you went on to live a life of sin or something like that, like you deconverted maybe, or you just generally were not walking with the church in some way, right?
Yeah.
Their thought was, okay, then you got baptized, which is necessary for salvation, but then you walked away. You can't be
Yeah.
rebaptized at that point. And so basically you're damned to hell. And so like a lot of the Donatists were teaching people, and a lot of the Donatists, like the priests and the teachers were waiting literally until their deathbed to get
Yeah.
to get baptized. Augustine wrote a book called Against the Donatists that kind of basically said that that's not right, and said that basically he considered it a heresy, and the Catholic Church sided with him. And so that kind of more or less killed that early Donatist. But that was, from my understanding, that was mainly like a North Africa thing, and other parts of Christendom didn't necessarily have that widespread of the teaching. The Donatists were mainly North Africa, I think, but which would make sense why Augustine was so concerned about it, because that's where he
Yeah.
was.
Well, I
Yeah.
feel like some of the like I can't remember the specifics of what I was told or what I heard and how accurate that even was. But I feel like there's some Eastern fathers who did that, and it was almost
Mm,
more out of a, I don't know, along the lines of like a piety thing, because they took that really seriously. Because that's,
mm,
again, that's a difference within Orthodoxy and Catholicism is you don't, like within, I'm used to Calvinism, like Baptist, Reformed, like we always said Reformed in the doctrines of grace, right?
yeah.
Soteriologically Reformed.
Right. Right. Okay.
Um, but they would say things like well, if you fall away after your profession, after your baptism and all that, that shows you weren't elect, right?
Hmm.
And so it's all abstract and esoteric. It's all this like ethereal spiritual thing.
Right.
But Orthodox or Reformed don't have that. They're just like, no, you were baptized.
Right.
You like this thing happened to you. It's
Right.
not like an abstracted idea thing. Like it
Hmm.
happened. And so it's a sacrament. And so so then that's probably where they would go. And I don't know what the donors say about this, but this is a shout out to my buddy Ao. We used to have debates about this kind of stuff all the time, but he doesn't believe in the perseverance of the saints. So like he thinks you can lose your salvation. And
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I don't
Well, the
know if
Donatists,
that's
the Donatists thought that too, and so that's
right.
that's basically why they didn't want to get baptized, because they
Right.
were like, well, once you go down that route, and then if you walk away, you are damned forever. So they're like, nope,
Yeah.
I want no part of that. So
Which is, and in defense of my buddy Ao, like, I mean, this is back, he was debating all these things with me when I was in like, Calvinist phase. And he was saying, like, there are these texts, like Hebrews. He's like, we care about the Bible, right? These things matter. We care about exegesis. What does this say? Like, once you've tasted the heavenly gift and you've partaken of the divine nature,
mhm,
if you then turn away, there's no longer remains a
right,
sacrifice for you. And he's
yeah,
just like, people don't take that seriously. They systematically theologize that away. And I
yeah.
don't
Well,
disagree with him.
I don't disagree. I think that it does require more. It does require a little bit more. Like if we're gonna you can't exegete the Bible, you interpret scripture with scripture, right? So you can't
Right?
just take it in isolation. So that
Right.
that that verse is saying something that I think that a lot of reformed, like kind of like the Calvinist types, would find very difficult to talk around,
Right.
right? In the same way, though, you could say, well, Paul said to, I think it was the Philippians, he who began a good work and you will carry it on to completion. It also says,
Right.
in the end times, people will come to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. And so, like that, if that were possible part is a
Right.
weird thing to put in there, if it is obviously possible for this to happen, right?
Right.
And so this is where, like, I think you have to hold those two things in tension. And I don't think that either side is going to have a super easy time bottling that up and making sense of it. In the same way that one of the things, and this is one of the things I wanted to get on into with it, about the whole like propositional knowledge, and is the book of James is very challenging to the reformed types, and it's one of the reasons that actually Luther did not think it should be in the canon, was because he literally wrote, he's like, I don't think James is
Yeah.
legit. And so because it's that whole faith and works thing, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you, and so this is where like you talk about, kind of acting out, and it seems like a very orthodox. So I wanted to get a little bit more of your take on, like, what is the relationship between like faith or propositional knowledge and action and salvation? Like, how does that work
Mm,
itself out in your mind?
yeah.
Because obviously you're not saying propositional knowledge doesn't matter, right?
Right.
What we say, you're not saying that. And you're not saying that we earn our salvation either, but they have to go together,
Yeah.
in some way. And so like, how do you think about this?
Right. So I love that, like what Rod Dreher said in that tweet thread. But he just barely touched on it.
Hmm.
I can't remember even the specifics of what he said. He said something like it's not as much of a focus on like what you propositionally think. He said, although that's there. Um, and I kind of got in that in my that conversation with Jeff and Sam and I, that I with Sam being able to say the Nicene Creed and do these things, and I just said I don't think the Orthodox just don't put as great an emphasis on, at least in my understanding. Again, like with all this stuff, like I'm speaking from what I know. Like I'm not
Sure.
speaking as like the official teacher of
Right. Yeah.
Orthodox theology.
Sure.
Um, they just don't put as much a great emphasis on like how what you consciously think and are able to articulate. It's just deeper than that. So that would probably be the way that I understand proposition in relation to faith. Um, I've I've been thinking and saying for a while that I almost think of um, propositional knowledge, like in the Vervaekian sense, because he says the four kinds of knowledge are propositional, perspectival, participatory, and procedural, right?
Hmm.
I would almost put propositional knowledge in another category, and I would put some caveats around it in that I see it I see propositional knowledge as, I think probably the easiest way to say it is propositional is potential,
Hmm.
but it's not real. It's not real until it's embodied.
Gotcha.
It's theoretical. And
Right.
so like almost in the sense of what JP and Jonathan Peugeot were talking about, one of the best ways I like to illustrate is when they were talking about, and I call this Eucharistic knowledge, is that when you're eating an apple, right, it doesn't do you any good if you bite it up and put it in your mouth and chew it up and spit it out. It gives you no
Hmm.
nourishment. It doesn't matter if you swallow it down to your body, but then you regurgitate it. It's no good.
Right.
It
Hmm.
has to actually become part of you in a sacramental way where it's, you do violence to the apple, but then at some point you have to give of yourself. Part of you has to die and give up indigestion to make this, to incorporate this apple, to actually integrate it and for it to become part of your body.
Hmm.
Propositional knowledge is just like that. And I think that's what the
Gotcha.
book of James is about.
Hmm.
And I think that's probably the easiest way to illustrate what I think is wrong with what I call the egoic intellect, or a lot of Western Christianity, is it is completely messed up and misunderstood that aspect of propositional knowledge,
Right. Yeah.
which is why they fight over ideas all the time.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, and I think it's important, because yeah, the kind of the reformed, Presbyterian in me be like, no, these are really important, right? The systematic
And I agree
theology,
with that.
and I know you do, and so that's where I want to like be very careful, because I think, you know, we kind of like, a lot of people will kind of be reactionary and say, kind of like, no, these are really important. Heresies are real,
Right.
and all this, and like
Yep.
stuff. And you're not saying that. You're saying, yeah, but it's not. And like James is saying, show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by what I do.
Yep.
Right. And so like, and this goes back to, Peterson talks about this a lot. Like, you say you believe this, but you do something else. Right.
That's why I
And
think Peterson is so important.
right.
That
Yeah.
that
Yes,
act
I
as if.
agree. I agree. Yeah. Act as if, because you're actually showing what you really believe, by
Right.
doing it. It's like if I'm, say, in like Chicago, you have that, kind of glass floor thing that you can walk out on. And
Yeah.
you can like stand over like your, however many thousands of or 1,000 feet down or whatever it is. Um, you can say, I believe that that's safe to do, right? But if you're not willing to actually walk out there, do you really believe that it's safe to
Right.
do? Or, you're affirming it with your mouth, but you're not actually acting it out.
Right.
And so in the same way that you can say, listen, I think that cheating on my wife is a sin. But if I'm going out and doing it all the time, do I really feel like that? Or, do I
Right.
really believe that? Or am I just affirming something because
Right.
that's what I'm supposed to do and that kind of stuff? Whereas someone
Mhm.
else who might not be nearly as judgmental about like going around saying you shouldn't, sleep around on your wife, if that person's actually faithful to their wife, who believes what, really? Um, and, obviously it's best if you can act out and describe what it is that you believe. Like that's the
Right.
ideal state. But given that we don't really know I don't think we know ourselves nearly as much as we think we do, right? And that's where the
That's the
elephant in the rider makes
thing.
a lot of sense to me, because I think that
Yep.
like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So that's where I think, I think it's maybe like a difference of emphasis that, what you're saying, it seems to me, is like propositional knowledge is all great, but it's what you do that actually tells me what you believe. And so, you can have like the right words, you can have the right statements, you can have the right rules and everything else, but if you don't act it out, if it doesn't become part of like you're participating in those truths, then you're not actually participating in truth at all.
Right.
You're
And this is
you're just
why I see the all of this stuff is connected to me. So like what Tom Holland is saying and realizing that Paul has been just really into recently, or that Rene Girard says, is that we really, you can only you can only critique Christianity from within Christianity. You're using Christian values to critique
mm,
Christianity.
yep.
And like, so what we see in the West currently, in the secular, air quote, secular West, is this extreme identitarianism, which we see in our politics. We see particularly around LGBTQ issues of like, well, you don't love me if you're non-affirming.
Right.
And this is what love is. But what they have done is they've just taken their religious heritage
Right.
which is propositional identitarianism, and applied it to their LGBTQ thing and said, this is what love is to affirm me in my self-identity.
Right.
And like, and then because of Christian political tribalism and the culture war that came out of the 80s, we just keep fighting about it. And we're like, no, that's dumb. That's dumb. And I'm like, that's the heritage you gave them. They
Right.
are acting exactly how you act. And this is why, to me, like, the answer within the Western church is to somehow, and I don't know how this is going to happen, there needs to be a repentance and a going back of caging everything around this ideological and identitarian and tribalism. And that's what I mean when I'm trying to talk about confessionalism. Like, I have no problems with confessions. Great. Confess all the
Mhm.
things you want to, list them out. But I know how that system acts as if in the world, and I know what it does. And
Mhm.
it excludes people based on conscious articulation of propositions, which is a shorthand. It's a tool, but it doesn't work in real life. And it leads to, this is why the Rhett and Link stuff is all connected to me. It leads to a situation of Rhett and Links. It leads to people who leave the church over LGBTQ issues. And like, some of these things are hard. Like, when it comes down to what does it mean to love practically in a church? And let's just use the LGBTQ issue as a practical example, because it's a big deal right now. And like,
Mhm.
within the Methodist church and just broadly, what does it mean to love someone who is LGBTQ, who self-identifies, who is same-sex attracted, or feels like they were born in the wrong body, or whatever? What does it mean to love them? Well, the broad brush spectrum of, like, the affirming crowd would say, like, unless you affirm them in that and say, like, it's fine, it's good, it's true and beautiful, and love is love,
Mhm.
you know, then you're not loving. And
Right.
the other side would say, like, unless you deny that, that's not loving. Because, like, I mean, and people will use whatever things. If somebody walking toward a cliff, it's not loving to let them walk off a cliff, right?
Right. Yeah. Sure.
I get it.
Yeah.
So
I have
what
a
does it mean to love
right.
people in that situation, and how do you do church between
Yeah.
those two groups?
Yeah. No. We're going through the book of John right now, and at my church. And so a couple of weeks ago, my pastor was talking about what he says, like, people typically identify when he's like, we don't use these words necessarily, but they typically identify in one of two camps. There's the truth camp or the grace camp, right?
Mm,
And so the
full of
truth
grace and
camp,
truth.
yeah. And so, like, the truth camp wants to just like tell people the right answer. This is wrong. You shouldn't do this. And you just want to come down. And that's you shouldn't, like, homosexuality is a sin. And you just want
Right.
to come down and, like, I'm telling you the truth. Right. And then you have the grace crowd. And what they want to do is just affirm, right? And just, like, basically, like, have unlimited grace and never really talk about the hard things and the sin and all this kind of stuff. It's more just like,
Or they
I
would
just
just
want you.
say it's not sin.
It's not sin. Yes, exactly. And so, like, he's like, okay, here's the problem. Like, if you think you're a truth person and that's what you do, you're not actually being a truth person. If you think you're a grace person and that's what you do, that's not what biblical grace actually is. He's like, truth, real truth, always includes grace. So if you're not including that and you're just going around beating people over the head with rules and that kind of stuff, what you're telling them is not actually truth. You're telling them maybe at best part of a truth, but not the truth, right? Because the truth is the gospel. That's the good news. And so, like, if you don't have the grace alongside what it is that you're saying,
Mm,
then it's not truth that you're telling them. It's pharisaical is what you're doing.
mm.
Um, and the grace side, he's like, what you're doing is not giving them grace. What you're doing is being an enabler. And, like, because grace in the Bible, grace always transforms, right? And so grace, there's always, like, kind of a vector of, grace when applied is transforming you to something else. And so if you just ignore the to something else, you're not giving them grace. You're giving them essentially license to do whatever, right? And so that was kind of, he's like, and basically he just ended up, he's like, I can't tell you in any particular situation how to really apply grace to someone and whatever. However, if you think you're a truth person and you're not giving grace, you're not giving them truth. And if you think you're a grace
Mm,
person and you're not calling them to transform to something, then you're not giving
yeah,
them grace. And that
right,
was the way he was like, that's an interesting way, I thought, to talk about this, because it's similar to what you're describing, right?
right. So then I had a couple thoughts I'd like your take on, and I think this is applies. So, um, so there's a couple aspects of it. When you were saying that, I would say the way grace and truth, you just laid out grace and truth, and I don't want to go for really far down this rabbit hole trail, but I feel like it's the exact same with judgment and mercy.
Hmm.
They're the same thing, and this is why I
Yeah.
love George MacDonald, and he says all the attributes of God are infinite, and so like they're all the same, and they're
Right.
all infinite. And so anytime you want to get those out of balance, you're no longer dealing with God. You're
Right.
dealing with things that you want to emphasize for your purposes.
Right.
Um, and so that's one thing. And then the other aspect is like truth. The thing I've been thinking about truth and talking with some people about is that there's this brilliant um, video that I haven't even finished yet by this guy named DC Schindler, who is connected to, and I don't know how much you followed this, but he's connected to, I believe, I first heard about him through Esther Meek. And so Esther Meek, Drew Johnson, have you heard Paul talk about them?
No, I don't think so.
So there's like Esther Meek, Drew Johnson. I put the three of them together, like Michael Polanyi, who are, because it started with Michael Polanyi, and then Esther Meek learned from him, and Drew Johnson learned from him, and a lot of what they talk about is that um, liturgy and just how our knowing is embodied. Like I think they're really central to this whole argument of like one of the things. I don't want to go too much into this. Dang, this deserves a whole talk. But like Michael Polanyi talked about subsidiary focal integration was one of his big terms. So he said like in order to see, and the way you could illustrate it is like riding a bike or playing guitar, playing piano, driving a car. There are little things that when you're learning that process, you have to focus on,
Right.
subsidiary things of like the whole vision that you need to focus on in order to learn the skill.
Right.
But then like Jordan Peterson would say, you learn that skill, you build neural pathways where like it takes it out of your prefrontal cortex and puts it into like a subconscious part of you.
Hmm.
But then that's what a habit is. And then you
Right.
have this habit that you no longer have to focus on and think about. It's embodied, but it's
Right.
knowledge. It's
Right.
embodied knowledge that you did have to focus on. Some of those things happen to us just biologically, evolutionarily, that we don't even think about.
Right.
Just
And you
most of our
couldn't
knowledge
you
is embodied.
yeah, and you couldn't do some of those things if you tried to focus on them.
No, you
Right.
couldn't. Like riding a bike.
Yes, exactly.
Is
That's the thing. Like, teaching my kid, my 4-year-old, to ride a
Yep.
bike, without the training areas right now. Like, you could see he's like, trying to think about, oh, I gotta,
Hmm.
whatever. And eventually he's gonna get it to where it's just like naturally, he's not thinking about it at all. But if you
Yes.
try to, like, if you, even someone who knows how to ride a bike, if I tried to really think about how to properly balance and do all this kind of thing, I tried to make that a conscious process.
Yeah. You'd
You
probably
can't ride a
wreck.
bike. Yeah, you can't
Right.
ride a bike
Or
that way.
you can't actually see down the road. So that's kind of his
Right.
point. Is like if you don't learn to how integrate these subsidiary things, you can't actually have vision to ride a bike,
Mm,
to
correct.
drive, because you bring all that in subconsciously through habituated practice, and then you can actually ride the bike. Playing guitar is that way. I'm learning to play guitar.
Hmm.
Like if you have to get to the point where you have to focus on it to train your hand.
Right.
But once your hand is trained, if you keep focusing on it, you actually can't play the song. You can't read the
Right.
music,
Yeah.
or you can't sing, or
Right.
whatever. And that's how that just that heuristic, that tool of understanding that, I think allows us to see this big picture a lot better. So DC Schindler is from that crowd. Esther Meek talked about him, and he's a brilliant guy. And he has this video that uh, Michael Michael Lady sent to me from this community, and he talks about beauty, and this is connected to like the Dostoevsky quote of "Beauty will save the world," and it's directly connected to the truth thing that you're talking about.
Mm.
And what's wrong with the West? The reason Dostoevsky, I think, said beauty will save the world is that beauty, out of like the triad of truth, goodness, and beauty is the one thing that he says, at least for a still, simultaneously plays instantly in the subjective and the objective at the same time.
Hmm.
He says you get both at the same time. When you experience beauty subjectively, you're experiencing something that isn't merely subjective. You're experiencing something that is also transcendent and objective, but
Right.
you do it at the same time.
Hmm.
I actually think what the West needs to do to repent is get at that same place with truth.
Hmm. Interesting. What would that look like to get to both the subjective and objective at the same time with truth?
Uh, this is all the stuff that I always talk about that I don't even quite know what I'm talking about, and that that most people I think misunderstand me. Is that to me what it means is that, and this is why I love the Peterson or even the Jesus. I talk about this verse all the time. The take the log out of your eye to help the brother, and like Jordan Peterson, tell the truth or at least don't lie. And this is the Orthodox understanding of theosis: is that when you purify. So Jesus, when he says, it's one of these obscure passages that people are like, what is Jesus talking about? But when he says, I think it's in Matthew 7, the eye is the lamp of the body. And if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is not healthy, your whole body will be full of evil,
Hmm.
essentially. Those words are really interesting in the Greek
Right.
anyhow. But I essentially think that one of the way that I would say it currently is that I think the process of theosis or purifying your eye, I would use those simultaneously or interchangeably, is you start by er, just eradicating self-deception. You burn off the dead wood. You stop
Hmm.
lying to yourself. So that whole process of us not really knowing what we believe,
Yeah.
that's all bound up in sin and self-deception and corruption. I think if you get to the point where it, maybe this is what theosis is, when you get to the point where you don't lie to yourself anymore or
Hmm.
others at all, I think even choice, agency, telling the truth, I think the subjective and the objective meet.
Okay.
I think that's what
Yeah.
holiness is.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like the vision of, kind of like whenever we're in heaven, we will know even as we are known, right?
Yes.
And so it's kind of like admitting that we don't even know ourselves, right?
Yes.
And so like really the only one who knows us really is God, and like we're called to try and like be honest with ourselves. We're always going to fall short of that. But I think that's why that phrase is that, like, you will know even as you are known, is so powerful if
Yeah.
you really understand it, because you're like, that's the Bible telling you that you don't know yourself, right?
Hmm.
And if you
Which
don't
is
know
very
yourself,
true. Like,
yeah,
I would affirm a lot of those Calvinist tendencies of like Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is wicked and deceitful above all things. Who can know it? Yeah, I get it.
yeah,
Like,
right,
I know it. Like, I'm like a half crazy person, neurotic. Like, I know that, and I'm in my head all the time
yeah,
analyzing.
right,
Like, but I think part of the freedom that I've found, and this is maybe just my experience, I'm not trying to universalize it. Part of my experience is that like within Orthodoxy, that all just shut off.
mm,
Like, it just stopped. I think it was the whole like, and I'll say this to Sam sometimes, like the whole process of trying to, because part of my deconstruction was, figuring out I didn't know what I thought I knew about hell, and just being like, whoa, what does that mean? uh what is what don't I what do I think I know but I don't really know about all sorts of stuff.
right,
It was almost like the it was the experience, I think, like of what Peugeot would say, almost of just like the expression of the infinite is also infinite. It's all of a sudden I got hit with that Jordan Peterson, like, oh, the world is full of, like, there's infinite facts,
right,
you know um and like I was just like, holy cow, I have no idea what I really think. And like my whole the I found out God by his grace, I would say, showed me that my intellectual feet weren't planted on a firm rock. I had no idea. And but what so then I was trying to, and I don't know, somewhat existentially, I've never had the problem of, I've always wanted to figure out what I think about all these topics. So then I went down this road of like early stuff, and I'm reading about like Nestorian controversies and like the my like I've never heard of this, but like Miaphysites and Diaphysites, Monophysitists, Diaphysitists, and like all the dual nature of Christ and all these early church debates. And I'm like, I don't know what I think about that. I have no idea. Like, I barely
Right.
understand what the people who hold the positions are saying. And then I got to the point of like, kind of like what we were saying earlier. It's not that I don't care about what I think about those issues and what they are, but it's a realization that like I can't ever nail all that stuff down.
Right.
And I think I think Orthodoxy allows me to stay in this place of like I have earnest convictions and thoughts about all sorts of things, but just like in my hierarchy of what I value, I just my own self-awareness of how I identify and how I think about things and what I think I believe just went
Okay.
way down.
Hmm.
And I just and I just submit to the church
Right.
because
No,
I
I
think
think
it's the only thing that holds truth transcendent of time.
right. And I think that that's one of the weaknesses of Protestants, is that we don't. I don't think this was true of the Reformers, but it's definitely true of like mainline and even evangelicals today. Is that we don't take church history or submission to the church and the teachings of the church over thousands of years. We don't really take those very seriously. Like we feel very
Yeah.
comfortable doing like treating it like a salad bar, right? I'll take what I like. I'm going to leave everything else, and I'm just going to move on, right?
Well, I mean, they can't though, really, right? I mean,
Right.
that's what's like sola scriptura. That's the spirit of what that is that it's not I'm not submitting to the tradition. I'm submitting to the Bible
Right.
and what but all that is still bound up in individualism because it's what I rationally apprehend and can see of the infinite facts in the Bible. You're playing the same
Right. And
game.
yeah, and then obviously like, you get 100 people and have them interpret the Bible, you're going to get 100 different interpretations of any
Right.
given, so you're like, even the idea that you are capable of interpreting the Bible correctly on your own by yourself without like a larger community and a larger context and all that kind of stuff is silly.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I always talk to whenever people really go hardcore on the sola scriptura, and like again, I grew up Presbyterian, like PCA, very conservative, that kind of stuff. So I'm not like not. I don't. It's not like I take the Bible lightly or anything else like that.
No.
But whenever someone like really goes hardcore on the sola scriptura, I was like, but you do know that it was church tradition that chose what's in the Bible, right?
Right.
Like what's canon was not. It's not like Jesus handed us the Bible. Like that was agreed upon by the church
Right.
over hundreds of years, right? It's not like
Yeah.
it just like dropped out of the sky. This wasn't like
Right.
Joseph Smith with the golden tablets or anything else like that. And so um that even that's a non-starter to me. It's always kind of been a non-starter, the sola scriptura thing,
Mm-hmm.
just because of it. Now that's not to say that all of church history is pretty or should be submitted to either. And so that's where it does become like a problem. Like, some of those Roman Catholic popes were not probably not even Christian, right? I mean, you have Medici's buying papacies and that kind of stuff, and you're like,
Mm.
well, am I really going to submit to some of those things? So that's where like a broader. That's why Orthodoxy is an interesting. It's under talked about. It's kind of like in America, it's Protestant and Catholic, right?
We
That's
just don't know
generally
about it, right? Yeah.
right. And so, but you have this other like kind of branch of Christianity and Orthodoxy that has also traditions. And so, and a very long one tracing back to the same time period that we're talking about, like the Catholics want to claim,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that. And so that's where I would find it interesting to bring Orthodoxy more into that. So when we talk about church tradition and church history and what exactly does it mean to submit to the church,
Mm.
if you're bringing in these because I mean the Orthodox Church also was pretty secluded from
Mm.
Western Christianity for a
Yeah.
really long time.
Yep.
Even by Augustine's day, he's talking about like that. He's basically saying, I'm reading some of these Orthodox guys and these Greeks, and he's like, I don't really know what they're saying. My Greek's not good enough. So basically, he's just saying like, I don't know if they're right. Maybe they have a point. I have no idea. So I'm just going to read the Latin, right? Because he was
Yeah.
more comfortable with it. And so
Yep.
like they've been pretty secluded, and that's where I would find it interesting if you could bring in the Orthodoxy and then the Catholic and kind of the Protestant perspectives, and then okay, well, what do we have in common actually?
Mm.
Because if we're on agreement about some things, like the divinity of Christ and that kind of stuff, then that's not an open-handed thing. Like you can't deny that and still claim like you're in line with church tradition. But then I wanted to talk about, I saw briefly the discussion that you were having, or like back and forth. I didn't really dig into it about the Rhett and Link stuff. So what is
Mhm.
your, you're talking about, you don't want to like exclude people, and that's, you feel like a lot of the propositional knowledge is that, right? It's a way of excluding and that kind of thing. But what is your position on like excommunication? And
Mm.
what does the Orthodox Church teach about that? How does that work?
So, short answer, I don't know. I don't know how the Orthodox Church views excommunication. And a lot of it is, so, I mean, so like, for example, I think in a local parish, if you have someone who's Orthodox, who's kind of like Jewish, and I mean, and this is gonna, this isn't good to like Protestant writers or elephants, but I think the way that it would play out is that if a priest sees someone, or the priests see people who are consistently in sin,
Hmm.
and it's not just like by, it's not it's not merely just like by articulating things propositionally that are different than the ecumenical councils or something, but people who are consistently practicing in sin, I think they would withhold sacraments.
Hmm.
So they would just be like, you're not partaking of communion. Um, in confession, like, I'm not giving absolution. Um, that came up because that came up recently. I went to like this young adults Q&A the other day, and they were talking about confession, absolution, and how that relates to things like, because it's interesting. I actually just went for my kids' school, because they go to a Catholic school. Um, I had to go take this training for like volunteering, which was this like 3-hour thing, mainly about like child abuse, which was just a really great time.
Yeah.
Um, and but so they were asking the priest at confession, and I just found this interesting, is that like, within the sacrament of confession, the priest is actually bound. And this was interesting. I don't know, Jen and I were talking about this. Some people will like it, some people won't. But the way that works out legally is the priest has no obligation, even as a mandatory reporter in confession, to report something.
Right.
Like, he actually isn't supposed to.
Hmm.
And so my priest was saying that sometimes, like in cases, and it hasn't happened a lot, but where someone is confessing something that is ongoing, where somebody's in danger, where like there's some mandatory reporter thing happening, he said he'll just put a hard stop. He'll just be like, okay, stop. We're not doing this anymore. We're done with the sacrament. We need to talk
Hmm.
outside of this,
Gotcha.
because, and they put the hard boundaries on that. So I mean, that's a little bit of an aside, but it's related to your question of excommunication. I think that's the way that they really view it, is that it's not, because I know there are people at our parish, I think, who aren't considered to be held in communion and community, but they come, they participate. People are nice to them. They don't get communion.
Hmm.
It's withholding sacraments is the short version. I'll talk for a half an hour about that, but that's the short
No,
version.
I think it's interesting because I didn't know with the Orthodox. I'm obviously more familiar with Catholic, where there is an official like excommunication, process. It's not just withholding Catholics. I didn't know if Orthodoxy had something similar.
There maybe is, but I'm just
Yeah.
not aware.
So I guess so. Okay, so you're saying, okay, if the priest, we'll call that for the purpose of this discussion excommunication.
Mhm.
If the priest sees someone who's consistently in sin and not repenting and just kind of like behaving consistently, and that he might excommunicate them. What about if the person, but it wouldn't be if I just said, hey, I don't think that Jesus was really God. You wouldn't excommunicate someone for that. That's a propositional claim.
I
I guess
don't
there's,
know.
yeah. I guess my question would be, if because I actually don't think that most Protestant churches would actually excommunicate someone for just believing that, or saying, "Hey, I don't really think that Jesus was God." I don't think they would. I think they would cross a line though, and I was wondering if you what you thought of this. If the person was going around teaching that
Mm,
Jesus was not God, right? Other part than you just struggling with it, like saying a small group and you're like, guys, I just don't think that he really was, and that kind of stuff. And it's more like your internal, like, this is what I believe, or this is what I'm struggling
mhm.
with, versus me going around and trying to convince all the other congregants that Jesus really wasn't God. That would be
Yeah.
probably an excommunicable offense. So I was wondering, because that's where it's kind of like, it's where the propositional statement meets action and sowing division
Yeah.
within the church and that kind of stuff. And so I was
No.
wondering whether or not that would meet your bar for like excluding, because it is
Yeah. No,
embodied at that point.
I think that's probably true. I mean, because then I think at that point you're manifesting a divisive spirit. You're seeking to
Right.
divide the body of Christ,
Right.
which is not okay. Which I would say you could do also from like the top down version. If like a pastor or priest came in and said like, this is something you're individually working through honestly and earnestly, you need to get out. Well, that's
Hmm.
being divisive. You're dividing the body of Christ because you or he doesn't really know what he believes. Like time is
Right.
the revelator type of a
Right.
thing. So no, I think that's probably pretty similar to how it would play out. I think just the difference is almost it's a it's a matter of emphasis probably. Like
Hmm.
I think in the Western church there's a lot more talk about all the propositions and things are framed that way. And even like my experience in the church, in one of my church experiences that I went into is um, part of their statement of faith. There was like 13 things, and one of them was affirming eternal conscious torment. And at that point, I would have probably identified as like an annihilationist.
Hmm. Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and I was just like, I can't, like, kind of like Sam in a very Protestant Luther way, like, here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God.
Right.
I can't affirm that. I don't think the Bible teaches it.
Hmm.
Um, I just don't at all. And so that was almost like you could almost think of that as like a sacramental way of withholding community, but it was based on proposition.
Right. Yeah.
Within that church experience. Whereas, like I was telling Sam in our conversation, the Orthodox would put it a lot more, I think, along the lines of practice and embodied things. Like, even with someone like Sam, I was saying, like, say, theoretically, Sam, his evangelical journey, which it didn't happen this way because he baptized, I'm sure, at an earlier age. I'm guessing they do infant baptism. I'm guessing they're
Well, how
Baptists.
what was his denomination before?
Biblical Unitarianism, and I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
don't know.
what that would be, but if I had to guess, I would say they probably believe in adult baptism. Just guessing. But
Okay.
I would assume then that he was baptized within that tradition. But let's just say he was raised biblical Unitarian, that's what he thinks, that's what he propositionally assents to, but somewhere along the way he had a baptism at a church, like say some established church, like say he was going to a Lutheran church for some reason that was Trinitarian and he had a Trinitarian baptism.
Hmm.
And that's what I was trying to tell him. And then if he came, because he says, he can't in good faith profess the Nicene Creed because he doesn't believe it because of certain things in it.
Hmm.
And I said, well, that's where that whole like subjective, objective truth thing gets, and just professing and knowing that you can't. I think if Sam changed the way that he thought about it, I think, let's just say theoretical Sam, who had a Trinitarian baptism, if he was wanting to become Orthodox, I think the priest would say, you had a Trinitarian baptism. That's fine.
Mm.
Like, you don't even necessarily individually believe in the Trinity. I don't necessarily care that much.
Okay.
And
What?
then if you're
Yeah.
able to profess the Nicene Creed almost like a way of humility, of just being like, I don't actually believe this. I don't think this is true. I don't necessarily think that it's within the Bible. But you have the humility to just be like, maybe that's my limitation
Mm.
versus the limitation of the church and Nicaea and whatever, and I don't know. So I'm going to profess the creed in a spirit of of ultimate kind of modern agnosticism
Mm.
about that,
Yeah.
even though you have personal convictions. I think the Orthodox would be like, that's cool.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. Certainly, I don't think the Catholics
Doing
are
it is what
either, but
matters.
right, yeah, certainly the Catholics wouldn't let you join.
And I don't know,
And
that's me
yeah,
imagining. That's
yeah,
my imagined ideal world, which I think is true, but may not be.
yeah, yeah. And then certainly Protestants wouldn't. I think there's a, there's a higher bar for joining and there's a high bar for excommunicating. If you want to, you know, you're not going to be able to say, no, I don't believe Jesus is God. You're not going to become a Catholic if that's your position. You're not going to become a Protestant for serious Protestants, I guess. Um, but they probably wouldn't excommunicate you in the Catholic Church if you just like told your priest, I don't think that Jesus was God in like confession or something like that.
Right.
Um, if you went around teaching it, and so this is where I would say, like, it's so for you, it's the sowing division part, and it's almost not even really important what it is that you're sowing division about.
Yeah.
Like the propositional knowledge itself, like the proposition itself, it's not like these you can sow division about, no problem. These you
Yeah.
can't. And so
Well,
this is where, like, well,
I
this
think
is
the
where the written thing,
propositional thing is hard because
right?
it's a modern phenomenon. Like I don't think ancient people had these discussions because of I think we've had a shift in consciousness. Like I think all these things were much more integrated before where like people weren't even thinking so propositionally. So it's a different thing. But like Paul says this stuff clearly, like, you know, you're sleeping with your father's wife. That's nope, doesn't
Yeah,
work.
right. Yeah,
You
totally.
know?
Yeah, yeah. And he's explicitly saying, like, are we not to judge the people inside the church? Like, don't judge
Right.
the people outside. You let them do what they want. But we are
Hmm.
going to be judging the people inside the church, of course.
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that, and this is where the Rhett and Link thing, like, to come first full circle about that, because I do think that some of these people, like, I wouldn't, like, if it was my church, I wouldn't excommunicate someone who thought, like, hey, I don't actually think that the Bible, like, I don't actually think that homosexuality is a sin, right?
Yeah.
However, some of these like Rhett and Link types, it does seem to me that the proposition aside, what you're doing is sowing division, right? By going around teaching it and like loudly proclaiming the church to be bigoted and all this kind of stuff on these particular topics. There is a certain like amount of like division that you're sowing, the topic aside, where you're actually like going to people outside of the church and loudly and publicly calling out the church for being evil in some way and that kind of stuff. And so that's where like it does in a lot of these guys types, it comes across to me not like I'm an earnest seeker. It comes across more like I'm standing in judgment over the church and sowing division myself. Um,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
that's the way I see a lot of this.
I think it's tough. Well, so I mean, so Rhett and Link are no longer members of whatever
Right.
church they were
Sure.
part of. And so that's a little bit of a different thing. And I think I said this in our conversation, Sam and Jeff and I's, is that what's hard about it, I think, is that you could say, yes, you're coming out loudly, you're coming out now and talking about this, which I'm of two minds about. Like, I don't have my unit of vision about this yet. I agree with what you're saying. I can totally see that. And I don't, and do I think it's going to be unsettling for a lot of people and trouble their faith for probably quite a few people? Yes. But this is where I would come in and say, like, it's kind of like, I would say it this way, is that I heard once that like nothing ever came out of the mouth of a drunk that wasn't in there to begin with. So like people will excuse,
Mm,
I was drunk and I said something. No, that's in there. You just, the
right.
barriers were
Yeah.
down. Um, if someone starts to struggle in their faith because of red and link, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So
I
I
agree.
think it's just a process of revealing what was really there. And I honestly think that right now we're in I think with this Jordan Peterson meaning crisis, Paul Vanderklay, Vervaeke, Peugeot, this little corner of the internet, all the stuff that we're talking about is I think we're in a transitionary period of figuring all this out and figuring out what's going on. And so it's almost like a birthing pains. I almost think of it about like birthing pains of like the beginnings of what Owen Barfield called final participation.
Hmm.
I think we're working through the ruins of modernity a little
Yeah.
bit. And so I agree with that, that it's going to cause a lot of problems. And you could have said, like, well, Rhett and Link, what you should have done was you should have just owned up and bit the bullet and spoke about this in your churches, in your community, with these people that you knew and loved, and worked some of this through. I think they were doing that a little bit. I think there were people they were talking to, but clearly, but this is what's so pernicious, I think, about this whole situation is, and they've said this many times, they were scared to. And I know why they were scared to, because I did talk to people in my local community
Right.
for a long time, and it didn't go well.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so, so I think that's where this whole thing is. Sorry,
Right. Yeah. And that's why
really
I
hard.
wouldn't. Yeah. No. And I agree with that. I don't think that. Yes, it is hard, and it's not like the church, especially in America, and is not. It's not, especially evangelical circles on some these issues. It's not like they're bathing themselves with grace and all that kind of stuff. It's not what's whole. They're not doing that a lot. At the
If
same
they,
time,
yeah,
yeah. At the same time, it does. Sometimes I do feel like, well, you just want them to change their mind about something at the same time, and you're like, now you're calling them out not because of the lack of grace with which
yeah,
they spoke about it. You're calling them out because they don't agree with you, which is exactly what they're doing
right,
actually.
100%,
And like, so like both of you actually, like, I don't really want to sit here and like hear you judging them or whatever. You're like, you guys are all doing the same thing from my
right.
perspective, like, and like, agree with me or you're a bad person, you're a bad Christian, whatever. Okay, I mean, if we want to do that, it's not super helpful to anyone, but
What they are is now is like almost in the UK they have these atheist churches, right? What Red and
yeah.
Link almost are now, although a softer version because they're agnostic or even hopeful Christian, they're almost like in a very Protestant, uh, very evangelical, just agnostic church
Hmm. Yeah.
that hasn't officially formed yet.
Right.
And so like this is they're out of the frying pan into the fire. Like they have fundamentally the same worldview. They've
Yeah.
just come to a greater self-realization through a process where they're more honest about it
Right.
internally. But this is where like the Jordan Peterson, I think it's Rule 9 or whatever, of like assume the person you're talking to knows something you don't. Well, like the problem that happened is neither, like my experience, Rhett and Link never talked about it, but neither party really did. And probably at the time I didn't either. Is like we had a disagreement about a doctrine, and like this is why we talked about like the hopeful convert with Sam and Jeff and I, is that like churches are perfectly with like someone coming into the church that's a hopeful convert if they're eventually going to become them. And they're
Right.
like, they're okay if that process is a little, take some time and whatever. But like if that person comes in and like never gets in line with all the things, there
Right.
will reach a point where they're just like, no, you're not okay.
Right.
But then, so like we have to figure out how can we have, this is what I would say, the church needs to figure out how they can have university propositional diversity as
Hmm.
as individual earnest convictions, and still maintain unity. And I think you have that in the objective sense that can only be held transcendently in some way outside of time, because none of us see it that way. I mean, we
Right.
just don't have that kind of vision. It's an iconic vision, and I don't know, the Rhett and Links are, because I agree with you, they like when it comes down to certain issues that they can no longer go to church, whether it's evolution or homosexuality, um, they think they're right, and they think the church needs to change, and the church thinks, no, we're right and you
Right.
need to change.
Yeah.
um, and I think it has to come down, and I think it comes down to that, like the individual and collective and time and truth and the subjectivity and objectivity is like, how does that all work? I think
Right.
that's the question of the modern West right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, the modernity, it's weird. It's like we sank back into kind of like a Gnostic heresy with a lot of these things.
Yep.
Um, and we don't call it that, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking about
Because we know
Gnosticism.
that's not right.
Yeah, we know that's not right, but we've totally bought a lot of the Gnostic problems, right?
Yeah,
Where
I agree.
and this is I think one of the things, and Dreyer, that in that tweet thread that he was replying to, he was getting into some of the participatory actions, and why is it that young men and that kind of stuff seem to start getting kind of, I see kind of a migration to things like Orthodoxy or Anglicanism.
Hmm.
I think it is because we're starting to realize that, okay, all of this knowledge, all these propositions and these statements of faith or science or whatever it is, or
Yep.
politics and that kind of stuff, actually, we don't find that nearly as fulfilling or meaningful as we thought that we would, right? It's like, once we get our theology straight, church is going to be great,
There's no
right?
responsibility in it.
No, there's no responsibility in it. Or okay, now my politician won. Happy now? What'd that get
Yeah.
you? Right?
Right.
So like science, okay, now we understand how this particular thing happens. Okay.
Right.
And
I want I want to look. So Dreher, he kind of summarized it by saying, and I think this is true. He said um, okay, where did he say it exactly? So he said, I can't tell you how liberating it was to me as a male to sense that I was given something to conquer
mm,
myself.
right.
And like that, oh my goodness. Like if we could get that, gets you out of just like the scapegoating, it gets you out of the judgment, it gets you out of the speck in your brother's eye, it gets you out of all of that. It's clean your room.
Right.
It's Jordan
Yeah, and
Peterson.
I think that that's why also Stoicism has kind of started making a little bit
Yeah,
of a comeback, because
I
it's like,
agree.
kind of master yourself. I think it's wrong in that I don't think that conquering yourself looks like being like Spock or Lieutenant,
Mm,
Commander
right.
Data or whatever. I don't think, and like a lot of times Stoicism will kind of do that. Just
Mm,
deny your emotions, right? Just like
mm-hmm.
detach from them and suppress them and that kind of stuff. And what I feel like Orthodoxy is giving you in a lot of ways is, no, you're supposed to conquer yourself, but not by not feeling the things that you feel, or it's not about ignoring them, right?
Right.
Because that's not what Jesus did.
Right.
It's not like Jesus never felt pain or sadness or any of those kind of things, or anxiety even about, when he's in the cross and he's clearly nervous about what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so conquering yourself is something to do that's really hard. But then also you're not taking the cheap way out and trying to suppress parts of you either, right?
Right.
That because if I'm not emotional around anything, I can't overreact. I can't get mad when someone says something to me, like my wife says something that's not fair. I won't get mad because I'm a stoic now. I'm suppressing all of that. But that's
Yeah.
not what we're called to do. And so I think that that's kind of like a misapplied version of conquering yourself is the stoicism. And that's where I do think that what Dreyer was saying, that makes a lot of sense. It's a harder road though, right?
Oh
It's a
yeah.
harder road than just than idealizing or idolizing our ideas,
Yeah.
or and it's a harder road than being a stoic and trying to suppress what we actually feel.
Can I jump off of that and say something? So
Yeah.
there's two
Yeah.
things. I was going to say this earlier. I was talking about it to my wife, but so do you remember the first thing before I go into that is Nathan Jacobs had talked about stoicism, and I didn't know this, but he had said in one of his conversations with Paul that stoicism, a lot of the ways that it's conceived of, and this is the way I thought about it, isn't apathy. It's not that you
Mm,
don't care about things. He said, like when I'm lecturing and my students have apathy, he said
right.
what stoicism really was classically was that it was you were supposed to create a buffer between the will and the passions.
Hmm.
So he said what happened is like something would happen and you flare up, the passions flare up, the animal, the instinct flares up. But he says the human
Right.
being in stoicism was like you create a space where you aren't just a slave to those passions. Where like those
Right.
passions are real and they're legitimate, but that you don't necessarily attach your will to them just instantly.
Hmm.
And that's what which that seems really Christian. But anyhow, so when you were saying you're you were talking about it's not just like submitting to your ideas, it's conquering yourself, really. What that reminded me of, I was talking to my wife about this. We were talking recently about how I am, I can tend to be somewhat of a zealot, and I'm pretty passionate about things, and like I can't, like there are just certain things I wouldn't be able to do. So I've been talking a lot about recently the movie The Hidden Life, A Hidden Life, that new Terrence Malick movie.
Okay, no, I haven't seen that.
So it's about it was pretty limited release, but it's about this guy who's Catholic now. I think he's been sainted actually. But his name is Franz. What's his last name? Franz something. It's a husband and wife, Franz and Fanny. I'm forgetting their last name, but they were Austrian, I believe, and it was during World War II, and essentially they were farmers. It's a beautiful movie. Terrence Malick's the best, but he essentially got called up to serve in the military, and essentially he couldn't, like he wasn't able to. He just said, I can't do this. And the whole movie is about this process of him not being able to do it, and it's this constant tension. He's talking with his lawyer, and he's at his trial, and all these people are saying, like, they're either yelling at him, they're angry, they're like, how can you defame your country and your people and your wife, and what are you doing? And he's like, this is a pointless stand. It's serving nothing. It's accomplishing nothing. No one's going to follow you. It's pointless. And all these people are saying all these things, and he's or they'll say just sign it. It's pointless. You don't have to mean it. Just sign it. It's irrelevant. You can sign it, serve in the military, say like you want to work in the medical stuff. You won't even have to fight. Just sign it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, he struggles over it, and he just can't. And he at the same time doesn't judge anyone else. He's just like, I can't. There's something in me. I can't do it. I can't do it. And my wife was saying, like, the whole time, we're just talking about it yesterday, just sitting together crying, because she realizes, like, the whole time watching the movie, one of the things that was hardest for her is she just knows, like, she's like, that's me. Like, if that happened, like, that would be me. I wouldn't be able to. Like, there's no way. That's almost like I'm a weird person. I'm an Enneagram 4, but like, that's almost my fantasy. Like, I'd love to be a martyr.
Okay.
Like, I just would love it. I mean, it would suck. It would be hard, but I would love it. And, but so this is what I want to talk about, the contrast of that. So apparently before he made this movie, Terrence Malick had written a letter to Martin Scorsese, essentially asking him, like, what does God want of us? More or less. They're both Christian. And because Scorsese had made, and we've talked about this a little bit in the channel, but the movie Silence, which was a book by Shizuko Endo, which is brilliant. So, like, I want to parallel these two movies. So, like, Silence is this movie about these Jesuit priests, Spanish. The main one is Rodriguez, who they go to Japan. It's very post-Christian, although there was a Christian heritage there, to be missionaries under this massively oppressive regime. And one of the ways that it's so cunning, like the way that the Japanese leaders, and these are true things, that they would root out Christians, is they had these things called fumis, which were just like little like almost icons, but they were like textured, like plaques or something, that would either have like Christ or the Theotokos or Mary or something on them, and they would put them out in front of people, because they'd be like, are you Christians? No, none of those are Christians, because they know, I mean, they'd kill them or put them in prisons. And so they'd put out this fumi, and they'd say, okay, step on it. And then a lot of times, and so that's like the core part of the whole movie, is there's this tension of, like, this is how they're outing a lot of Christians. A lot of people wouldn't step on it, and they would end up in prison camps and die. Some people they'd step on it, but come back to Christian community, step on it, come back to Christian, like this constant. Silence is one of the most brilliant movies and books I've ever read. And so there's this priest who's like also a zealot, who's just like, I will not deny Christ. I'm going to go serve these people. I will die. I will do all this. And the spoiler alerts, but one of the pinnacle scenes in the movie is he's been captured, he's been interrogated. There's all these philosophical conversations about things like, it doesn't matter. Just do it. It's what matters is what's in your heart. It doesn't matter if you step on this thing. That's Orthodoxy and Protestantism. That's
Yeah.
Gnosticism. Like,
Right.
doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And this priest is like, he can't do it. He can't do it. They take him out this one night. He can just hear this weird sound every night. He keeps hearing, and they bring him out one night, and he realizes this weird sound that he's heard are these people wailing that they've hung upside down. They've put little slits behind their ears where they're bleeding, slowly bleeding out over these pits of dead bodies and excrement, hanging upside down in pitch black, and they're just making inhuman sounds. And there are these Christians that they're torturing who wouldn't step on the fumi. And they bring him out and they say to this priest, the head priest, the one who's converted all these people, who's been doing the sacraments, who's been leading these people, and they say, step on it and we'll stop. Step on it and we'll stop torturing these people. And so like he's just, there's such a conflict in this guy of like, what is faithfulness right here?
Right.
And he hears this voice, and this is a part, like I was reading this book like in a pub, I was in a coffee shop, and Rodriguez hears this voice, and he says, and it says, step, it's for this reason I came into the world. It was to be trampled upon by men. And he steps and just collapses. It's like, it's one of the most powerful, it took my breath away when I read it. And what's so weird, right, is you have Franz in A Hidden Life, and you have Rodriguez in Silence. And this is what I told Jen, and I said, and I think they're both faithful. Mm-hmm. And they did opposite things.
Right.
It's such those two movies are like those are like the art of our times for Christianity. Yeah. I think. And I don't even know what what all that means.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful. It's a beautiful juxtaposition. And I said, I feel incredible resonance with both of those responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it does go to show just kind of like the incredible emptiness of the propositions without action, right? Without sacrifice or whatever, right? And without that kind of, and so that's where, like, whenever I always, and this is why I wanted to talk to you, is when I see you talking this card, it's like, actually, I don't think that I disagree with him. I think that like it does seem empty. If I can memorize Calvin's Institutes and that kind of stuff, and it would be very empty if it didn't actually cause any change in me. If I can memorize the Bible, if it doesn't cause any change in me, if it doesn't cause me to do something different, if it doesn't help me conquer myself in that sense. Sorry, my room is going off.
Okay.
Yeah, so if it doesn't, and so that's where and that art is really great. I really liked Hacksaw Ridge for a very similar reason. Is that that faith actually caused a change in that person. Like it wasn't just a rule that I memorized, right? And yeah, so I like that, and I do think that that's one of the reasons that increasingly Orthodoxy is drawing a lot of young men, because we don't want to feel disembodied anymore. Like it feels very empty, right? And it's just, and I think that like social media and everything else is exacerbating the problem, right? Because increasingly it's just words, right? We're just talking. We're just saying things, and we're arguing about this or that or the other thing and whatever, but it seems so very empty and like a waste of time, even for someone like me who loves theology and philosophy and that kind of stuff. You're like, I love this stuff and I'll talk about it. But honestly, what I like to do more than writing, like, going back and forth on whatever, is actually just talking to someone about ideas, because there's a difference when I can see your face and I'm looking in your eyes, even though we're sitting across the country and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
There's a difference there, right? Where like we're talking about something and it means something, and maybe, just maybe, we'll both take something away and it'll change
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And that's where I do think that, we talk about, that is one of the things that, um, oh, what was his name? Marshall McLuhan talks about, the medium is the message, right? Um,
Mhm.
and so, the idea is that, what's important, what his point was is that, listen, we can talk about what's said or what's written and that kind of stuff, the content, right? The real message is actually the medium in which you send it.
Mm.
Because what we did with like writing and that kind of stuff, what we did was we elevated just the words and the ideas to be like the
Mm.
highest.
Yeah.
um, and but once we start going around that, and so now no longer is it's that, now there's stuff like what Paul does where it's conversations between people, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like almost weirdly technology is getting us back to a more honest conversation between two real
Yeah.
people, because I can write a huge think piece on why Sam's a heretic and that kind of stuff. But if I'm sitting there talking to Sam, I'm not going to say those things, right? I'm going to
Right.
engage him as an image bearer of God, and we're
Right.
going to talk about things, and it's not going to be nearly as antagonistic as it could be if we
Right.
just treated them as the ideas and the words and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so that's where I do think that, like, the more church can get back to that, to the actual interpersonal connections and like the living and acting out, and that's where liturgy and everything else
Mhm.
comes full circle, where it's not just remembrance. I hate that. I do not, even as a Protestant, I don't like the just mere remembrance of communion and that kind of
Well,
thing. Like,
that's not, it's nominalism.
yeah, it is totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're like, okay, well, so nothing really is happening here. Why do this to remember? Why can't I remember in other ways and that kind of stuff? Like, why?
Like, yeah, let's go out for coffee, or we could eat some coals.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Good
Like,
Will Hunting.
yes.
It's
Why is it got to
arbitrary.
be grapes and bread? Why then? If that's all we're
Mhm.
doing, right? And so that's where I do think that, and it's so countercultural, but it's countercultural in a way that actually no one's really arguing about, right? Like, we're countercultural maybe in the, like, our views on like homosexuality and that kind of stuff, but like now we're just
Yeah.
hitting the culture war stuff.
Mhm. Yeah.
But we're all like, if you really like kind of hone in on the participatory nature of worship and liturgy and all this kind of stuff, now we're being countercultural, but in a way that, like, it's hard to criticize, right? This is not a culture war
Yeah.
thing. Like, no one's
Right.
like, it's not like the atheists are gonna be like, no, Gnosticism is the way and that kind of stuff. Like, it's gonna be weird for them. And so
Right.
I think that we are, and that's something. And what I like about that also is that, it's not really threatening to anyone. Um,
Mhm.
like, no one feels judged by like saying, no, we're participating in this kind of stuff. But then also, like, I do think people want that otherworldly experience that Dreyer was talking about. They want
Yeah.
to feel like they're part of something different, right? And I do
Mhm.
think that's why actually atheist churches tend not to work, is because you're
Mm.
not really giving anything. There's no otherworldly experience, really. Like, what is the transcendent thing that I'm
Yeah.
participating in? What?
Yeah, nothing
Nothing.
transcendent. Yep.
No. And so, like, then it just becomes empty words, and it
Or
feels
they'll
very
say
hollow.
or they'll say love, because like that's a Rhett
Right. Yeah.
thing. He said, if I had to say what my faith is now, it's just love. Well, okay, but is it Gnostic love? Like, what does that
Right.
mean?
Yeah, what does love
Where does
mean?
that
And
found? Yeah.
it's the same thing yeah, I mean, it's the same thing with, I mean, we talked about it before, like the grace. Like, grace, biblical grace
Mm.
transforms, and love does too.
Yeah.
So what are we transforming people into? Like, what is that vision that we have? And how am I going to be transformed by grace and love? Like,
Right.
what is the end of this? So you can't just say
Right.
love as if it's like this anchorless thing with no vector involved and all that kind of stuff. You're like,
Right.
no, that's not what it is. It's something else. We have to, like, have that conversation. But that's where I do think that Christians should almost, like, double down and go back to a lot of those, like, kind of more ancient practices of really being heavy into the liturgy and that kind of stuff, because it does give that kind of transcendent feeling, the same way you walk into like a European cathedral. It's just kind of
Mhm.
overwhelming in a sense, where you just like look around, and this is not just a high school gym with a bunch of chairs, right?
Beauty.
um
Beauty.
yes,
That's a. I
beauty.
mean, it hits the subjective and the objective at the same time. And it's undeniable.
Right.
It's why people. It's why music is such a thing. Atheists will talk about music and like why they don't, like why they just Like, I can't explain it
Yeah.
because they
So
can't, because there's,
yeah, Jeffrey Miller, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a professor. He's an evolutionary psychology professor, I think at New Mexico State or something like
no,
that.
yeah.
Anyway, I follow him on Twitter. He's interesting. Um, but he tweeted this thing today that I thought that you would like. But he said, a beautiful piece of art can make any atheist into an agnostic.
Mm,
And I was like, that's an interesting, yeah, because you can't, like, what on why is that
yeah,
beautiful? Why is that hitting me that way? Right? It's
yeah.
not just, it's just molecules reflecting light back at me. Why would that do this? Why would the
And
scene
that's where I would
transcend?
say, yeah, that's why act as if is also important even for atheists, is because
Mhm.
when you're an atheist and you experience beauty, you don't act as if an
Right.
atheist. You
Yeah.
don't.
No.
You're also being an identitarian. You have the same functional worldview,
Right.
and you realize it's not true when you
Right.
see beauty.
Yeah, right. And Jordan Peterson pointed that out to Sam Harris, right? Whenever they did their
Right.
conversation, and we were
Well,
like, "But you
tried
think
to.
you're,
Gave it
yeah, yeah." Well, you said, I mean, he did point blank say, he's like, "Well, you say that you're an atheist, but you
right.
don't act like you are."
I just
Um,
don't think, and this is the danger, like this is the danger of someone in my last one-on-one talk with Paul when I was talking about the egoic intellect. I think it's the danger of someone like Sam Harris, or even really, so I came out of this Reformed Baptist intellectual tradition of people that are really into doctrine and study and
mhm,
systematic theology and things, or like Sam Harris. It's almost like I tell people this, like I'd almost rather, unlike the IQ spectrum, I'd almost way rather talk to someone on the very low end than
hmm,
someone on like the upper mid end. So I'm just like, you're you're or the very very high end. Because I just feel like you're brilliant, but like you're not going deep enough.
yeah,
Like there's something underneath that you're not seeing. And like Sam Harris, it's the this is why I used to say all the time, like it's the truth outside the truth you currently apprehend. It's the truth that's bigger than you. It's the infinite behind. The expression of the infinite is also infinite. You're seeing all these expressions, and you think it's why the information. It's who said that? Alan Jacobs, but I think Paul Vanderklay quoted this the other day. Who quoted this? But Alan Jacobs, who's a scholar, Christian thinker, but he said the technology or the internet. No, Tim Keller said it in that old video I posted, but he said that the internet is the friend of information and the enemy of wisdom. What that pithy little phrase means is that
mhm,
it's giving you all these facts,
right,
the infinite facts, but you have no hierarchy, you have no frame, you have no consciousness, you have no. When you see truth in a modernist frame like that, it's fundamentally untenable. It can't
yeah.
continue.
Right. I think that's right. I think especially, as someone like gets smarter and smarter and they read more and more and everything else, there's a tendency to try and tie everything up in a nice neat bow, right? And
Makes them a
like,
better devil.
yeah, just read, like, get rid of all the mystery, right?
Yeah.
Because like I'm smart enough and I'll come up with a system where I think I've gotten rid of the woo, all the mystery, and it's all like
Yeah.
just kind of tightly packaged. And two things on that. That's where, I think that in the reform circles you would call the noetic effects of sin, right?
Mhm.
Is very underappreciated because our sin actually affects our ability to think correctly, like even if you're really smart. And so like just because you're really smart doesn't mean you're less sinful than someone on the low end of the IQ spectrum, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What it does actually is just gives you more horsepower to engage in sin,
Right.
intellectual sin. And so like
That's precisely it.
the noetic effects of sin is actually more dangerous for you because
Yep.
you could actually, and this is why I think the Bible talks about teachers are going to be judged harshly and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff, because like if you allow yourself to be overcome by your own sin, you're going to use your intellect for evil in a way that someone else may not be able to.
Right.
Um, so there's that, and it reminds me of like the ending of Job, right? So Job is sitting there and the whole book he's trying to figure out, why did all these things happen to him, right? Why did I lose my wealth and my kids and all of my health and all this kind of things, right? And
Mhm.
so he's demanding an answer of God, right? I want a bow. I want to know the reason, right? I want to
Mhm.
figure it out or whatever. But notice what happens at the end is God never answers that question for him, right? He just shows up.
What a
And he
grace.
yeah, and he just shows up and he's like, "Okay, smart guy.
Yeah.
Like, let's talk then. You think you know everything, do you? Okay, well
Yeah.
let's." And Job had no response to it. And I think that's where I love that, because it's just basically Job just realizes where his place is. His place is
Yeah.
not to demand answers or reasons or tie everything up in a nice bow and figure
Mm-hmm.
out what is on God's mind. That's not his place. His place is to assume the rightful orientation toward the God of the universe.
Yep.
That's his place.
What that
And that's the
reminds me
only
of is
lesson.
that reminds me of when Jesus is just like, which of you, being a good father, if your son asks for food, will give him a stone, or like will give him a serpent? Like, God is a good father and he'll give you what you need. And a lot of times, God being a good father doesn't give us answers
Right.
because it would be worse
It would be worse.
for
Yes.
us.
I don't think that, because that's not our place, right? And so
Right.
like
Exactly.
if God loves us, he's not going to put us, it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever watched the show The Dog Whisperer.
Mm.
And so anyway, it's this kind of silly show on TV where this guy goes into people's houses and their dog is just like terribly behaved,
Oh,
like
I think
bites
I have
neighbors and all that
just
kind of
seen
stuff.
like,
Yeah,
yeah, a
like
little bit. Yeah.
anyway, one of the things that he talks about is, especially with like very small dogs, is that, or just dogs in general, is that if you don't actually discipline them, if you don't act like the alpha in your pack or
Mm.
whatever, then they think that they need to, right? And so then they do. And he's like, the problem with it is that they're bad at it. That's not what they were bred for, right? They're like, this little chihuahua should not be the alpha and biting the mailman and whoever comes into your house. That's not his
Mm.
job to protect you from,
Yeah.
neighbors visiting and all this kind of stuff. But you put him in that position where he thinks that is the case.
Right.
And I feel like God wouldn't be loving if he put us in a position that that's not what we were called to do,
Mm.
right? It is not our job to have all the answers and to know everything and all that kind of stuff. Our job is right orientation toward him. And he wouldn't be a loving God if he let us get there.
Yeah, that's great. A friend sent me recently this article by some, I don't know. It was interesting. I'll actually send it to you because I'd love your thoughts on it. I found it fascinating. It was written by this like genderqueer feminist. I think, well, no, she's trans. It's a trans woman. Um, yeah, I don't know. She's maybe all those things. You maybe can be. Can you be genderqueer, trans,
I,
feminine?
I don't know what these words mean anymore. So
I don't know which ones. I don't know which ones are like you can't hold
everything,
together.
it seems like, yeah, I can't tell if they're
But anyhow,
contradictory.
the article was really interesting, and it ended on a bang. I actually loved it. It was a fascinating article, but it was talking about the basic idea of the whole thing is that everyone is feminine, um, and it was my knee-jerk reaction to it was to remember Preston Sprinkle, and I talk a lot of. He's writing a book on gender right now, and I've
Mhm.
been talking to him a lot. And connected to all this, which is something we haven't gone into, I've been thinking a lot about gender and masculinity and femininity. And this is where I almost do agree, because you were talking about conversations. A thought that I had is that this is where I will agree with like the patriarchy people. Is I do think the West is inflicted with hyper patriarchy in
Mhm.
our intellect, and we
Mhm.
haven't created space for potential expression, openness, which is a very feminine thing.
Right.
Um, and so this
And
article,
Dreyer made that point too, right? In like
yeah,
certain reform circles, especially, is hyper masculine, and I agree with that. I think that's right.
right. And so this article was saying it reminded me of something that Lewis said, and then that also reminds me of this Rilke quote that I love so much. Is he said like the most intimate experience of the divine is feminine because that is the experience of bearing and receiving.
Mhm.
And Lewis, in the end of Paralandra, um, he has some line. I need to go find it, the exact quote, and it's good, and it's within this whole big cosmic dance that happens at the end of the book. But because Paralandra is about this Eve character on her own planet, and
Right. No,
um,
I love the space trilogy. I
okay,
love
yeah,
Lewis's
so
space
you've
trilogy.
read
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So, but at the end, he has some line because also like her Adam is revealed, and so it's a lot about these like the essences of masculinity and femininity and that
Mhm.
glorified and what that looks like. But then all of a sudden, like somebody shows up, and Lewis has this line where he says just like where he essentially says something like, because everyone is feminine in relation to the divine masculine.
Yeah.
Which is true. Like we just don't, I mean, that's very much like this is how all those works, like father and then the son, and the son is
Right.
logo. The son is masculine, is the divisive thing, but the son is feminine in relation to the father.
Correct. So yeah, he does not consider equality with God something mass. He submits himself to God's will. Yeah.
Yes, we are feminine in relation to Christ as men.
Right. Yeah.
Women are feminine to us in relation to like a family. But like it's just I don't know. I don't know how that's related to what you were saying, but it peaked up somehow. It's the idea of I actually think, and I've talked a little bit with Mary about this, Mary Cohan, and some other people, Sarah and I talk about this. That's an easy way to, I think, summarize what I think the West needs. Is we need a infusion of divine femininity, which, again, like to give another Orthodox, like the Theotokos and Mary, like the female saints, that's something that's just always been a very native element within Orthodoxy and Catholicism.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think that, the fact that we have been we've made it very hyper masculine, and you're removing some of those things, then it makes sense. Well, then the only way to participate in anything is to be hyper masculine, which doesn't make anyone happy. Right. Which is why I think that, like, even, we're talking about, oh, well, we're in the patriarchy, but it seems to me that the solution that I keep getting seen pushed is for women to behave more like men. You're like, well, wait, that is that going to make them happy? Right. It seems
that
like you're saying that
goes into that some.
Oh, does it? Okay. I mean, that makes sense to me, because you're like, well, wait, you're telling me that we're like masculinity has run amok and we've made everything masculine. And now you're saying, and the solution to that is for women to be masculine.
Yeah.
And
it's very, it reminds me of like your old boy Driscoll, just like, you're not a man.
I know.
Boy.
I was at that sermon. That was an awkward room, man.
And there's part of me, like, this is, cards on the table. There's part of me that loves Driscoll for that. Like, Driscoll was a lot of things. He's not a coward.
No. And here's the thing. There is a certain type of guy that actually I don't think that he's wrong about. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a certain type of guy that actually doesn't need to be coddled anymore. And like this kind of like this Peter Pan syndrome, eternal boyhood, and that kind of stuff is like not useful to anyone. And so there's a certain part of me where like, yeah, that guy probably need to hear it. I was like, there's a lot of guys in here that aren't in that situation, and I don't know how helpful this is for women. But okay.
Well, they need to man up.
Yes, be a man. Oh god,
that's for you, Shelley. Shout out to Shelley. I like to say, just completely joking, bordering on sexist things. If you didn't know me, take that out in a clip. If I was famous, people would take, like Joe Rogan, people would take that out in a clip and out me.
Oh yeah, one of my friends was on, or not my friend, but I met him a couple of times. But he went on Rogan. Colin Moriarty. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
I remember the name.
Yeah. So he started this. It was like this kind of video game and pop culture, kind of one of those nerd YouTube video channels. I think it's called Kind of Funny. So he's one of the co-founders of it. I knew him because I was working in Xbox for a while, and so he was doing game reviews for IGN. So anyway, so I met him at a couple of events, but he there was this, like a few years ago, there was this day without a woman, like kind of trending thing on Twitter, where people were supposed to like talk about what would a day without a woman be like, and you're supposed to say all bad things, right? You're supposed to like, oh, we couldn't, blah blah blah. And so he made a joke and he said, peace and quiet, hashtag a day without a woman, and it just like went viral. Oh my goodness, he like his co-founders kicked him out of his own company, and anyway, he ended up going on Rogan, and because Rogan was talking to him about it. It's like, what happened there? And he's like, he's like, Colton was like, it's not even really a funny joke. It's kind of like a cliche. It's like, it's every Married with Children episode ever. And he's like, I
Yeah.
don't know, it wasn't funny, but I also don't think it was like super offensive that warranted the reaction. I was like, yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds about what Twitter's good for, is, not being funny and also overreacting to everything.
Oh, that's hilarious. And it's so fun. Like my own marriage is so different than that because my joke is that like relationally and verbally, I self-identify as a woman. So like I'm very interested in ideas, but like I'm the emotional one. I'm the one who
Interesting.
talks all the time. And so it's like so things like that are funny because like the peace and quiet, I'm sure my wife would just be like, amen. Like if we got rid of that self-identifying woman.
Yeah, so in the relationship, she's the withdrawer and you're the pursuer.
Oh yeah,
You think-
for sure.
Yeah. I always thought that my wife and I were the opposite, where I was the withdrawer and she's a pursuer. And then it turns out, no, it's the exact opposite. It's just that whenever we're having problems, I'll pursue, but if she keeps withdrawing, then I start to be like, okay, I'm not pursuing anymore. Like because it
Yeah,
hurts, right?
yeah,
Because I don't want to, like, it hurts to be like, no, I don't want to talk to you. I'm not ready, blah,
yeah.
blah, blah. And so then I stop doing it. And so that's why we always thought that. And then I'm also super stubborn. So I'll just wait for her to come to me at that point. And so then
Yeah.
it made it seem like I was the withdrawer, but actually, like, early on, whenever we're not seeing eye to eye, I do pursue and she withdraws.
Yeah.
But then I just get stubborn and I become an asshole, and then I
Right.
just, nope, I'm just gonna sit back. No, you're gonna have to come to me now. So
Yeah. Oh man, yeah. So it's funny because I love talking about relationships. Like that's one thing. I love the Discord, and it's interesting because we can talk about ideas and things. But I'm way more, especially now, when I've kind of done a little shift. I'm still obviously very interested in talking about ideas, but like just talking about like if when we do come out and visit you in Seattle
yeah.
sometime, like those are my favorite. I love like going out to dinner with couples and just talking about relationships. I mean, it's a
Mhm.
level of intimacy that a lot of people aren't comfortable with, but like I love that stuff because like
Yeah.
I'm into psychology. I'm into like temperament stuff. I'm into relationships. I'm into relational. Like I could do that all day.
Yeah, no, I like doing it too. Yeah, you're right. I think it makes people uncomfortable because they don't like to be very exposed,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. But again, like, as a Christian, and I wonder if this is another reason that Orthodoxy is a little bit more comfortable for you, especially for like Protestants, like, because you don't have confession, right? You don't really talk
Hmm.
about things, and it's kind of like pretend everything's okay. But as a Christian, I'm like, well, but if you're not willing to talk about it, you're not willing to expose it to the light, right? It still has power over you,
Yeah.
right? In that sense, like, you're still a slave to your own sin because
Right.
you're not willing to admit to what extent it has a grip on you.
It's
And so,
controlling
like,
you.
yeah, exactly. And so, like, it's freeing in a way to just say, nope. I don't know if you've ever read, you might like it, the book, The Freedom of Self Forgetfulness. Um,
No.
It's by Tim Keller. It's only like a 25-page, almost like kind of a pamphlet, but you might
Mm.
like it. But yeah, he goes into that. But like, you need to stop thinking about yourself so much,
Oh
like, as
damn.
if,
That's
like,
something I need for sure.
yeah. So, well, it basically is just like, it's freeing to think that, listen, you're, yeah, you're selfish and you're all these things and all that kind of stuff, but like, your sin is not like the core story of the world either.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's not what's going on. And so, like, almost like that forgetting yourself, and that what allows you to give both grace and truth simultaneously when it's not about you, right? It's not about you at all. It's about,
Yeah.
like, transformation for the sake of the other person. And so anyway, so it's an interesting book. I think you'd like it, but I do think that that's where, like, the lack of confession in Protestant practices, while I think that there's maybe some theological justification for it, um, is practically not super helpful, because what ends up happening is no one confesses to anyone
Mm.
any sin.
Yeah.
And then it festers, and it doesn't, like, you never get into that kind of, like, practice of, like, just exposing yourself in your own sin and,
Yeah.
like, not letting it control you.
Yeah.
um, and so that's where, like, even if I didn't necessarily believe that the priest was actually giving me absolution,
Hmm.
right? Just the practice of going and confessing is
Yeah.
itself a useful thing to do.
Which I think is, so a couple things. I actually was part of a lot of small groups that were really great at that. Well,
Hmm.
and I also found, I don't know, I learned this from the first small group I was ever part of. My first small group leader was really great at this, of just like opening up with vulnerability, and it created an atmosphere where then other people followed. It was
Yeah.
a mimetic desire a little bit.
Hmm.
It
Yep.
created invitation. And then I always, because I mean, you can call it a gift or a curse, but like I'm very transparent in things. Like I don't people would always talk about like the thread of like, what if all your sins were just displayed on like the whatever it's called. What do they call them now? PowerPoint.
Oh yeah.
Front. And I would just be like, sweet, then we could get down to work and everybody would just
Yeah.
know the truth. Like
Yeah.
that'd be fine. Throw them up there. Like I don't
Yeah.
care. And so in small groups, a lot of times I would kind of lead doing that is I just throw stuff out there. I think almost like shock value level things, and people would just be so like I was part of communities that had a really good experience of
Hmm.
that. But then the other thing I think is that it's one of the things that's fascinating to me. I kind of follow the online comic community. Part of that's connected to Rogan, but just like a bunch of other guys, people. And one of the things, Dak Shepard, his podcast, they always talk about all the time is just like AA and
Right.
sobriety groups and
Yeah.
confessing and opening up, all these things that are just like completely, it's actually all rooted in like Ignatian theology. That's all the
Right.
same stuff that like the Jesuits and Father Rodriguez was about.
Right.
And it's an interesting thing. Addiction and individualism and depression, and then like opiate addiction, alcohol, drug usage, like all those, this is the grace of the way that God has established the world, is that the deeper you go into these things, like where will you go to escape from me? If you go down to the depths of Hades, I'm there. Like you're gonna find God
Yeah.
somewhere. No
Totally.
matter.
And that's part of like, Holland's dominion and that kind of stuff. Like it's like God and Jesus has seeped into every aspect of not only our culture, I would argue the world itself, the universe itself. Like it's all
Yeah,
there. You can't escape it. And I
right.
think that you're fooling yourselves to think that, oh no,
Lost you. Can't hear you. Your ear pods are going dead, huh? A little bit. Maybe that's just fate because I go to the bathroom.
all right, sorry. Can you
Oh
hear me
no, I
now?
can hear you now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, something. I had to switch one of my AirPods was dying, so I switched
Oh,
to the other one and it got up.
finish out your thought. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I was saying like there's no way like to think that we didn't just inherit this and we can escape from God and
Yeah.
Jesus and Christianity. It's just like a pure figment of your imagination. And to back
Right.
to your original, one of the points that you were making earlier is you can only critique Christianity within Christianity
Yeah.
because like we're all sitting right in the middle of it, like
Yeah.
Jesus' story. That's what we're doing. So
All there is Christ and Antichrist. That's Rene Girard. Like that's his
yeah,
point. It's like there aren't other options
right,
anymore.
yeah,
The fullness of time has descended.
yeah. No, okay. Well, I'll let you go. It's 10:30. I really enjoyed this. We should do this more often.
It was a lot of fun. Well, I think we both like ideas, obviously. And I think we have really similar backgrounds. We could talk about, I know you were raised in like a classical Christian
Yeah.
school and like classical ed. I was deep in like the classical Christian ed world for a long
Okay.
time.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah.
we could talk about all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. We can talk about that and how like random Calvinist Reformed guy got really into Aquinas and Catholic theology and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
personal testimony stuff is fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I'd love to do that. Do read this. I do want to talk to you about the freedom of self-forgetfulness.
Yeah.
And have you ever read the story of Brother Lawrence?
No, but I've heard of that, and that's been one of those things that's been referenced to me a few times.
Okay, I'll send you the name of it, but that's also like a really good kind of long suffering and
Yeah.
communing with God through suffering thing that I think that you will like. It's a little bit
Yeah.
orthogonal to what we're talking about today, but I read it and I was like, I bet Luke would like this. So
Oh, nice.
I'll send you that. But yeah, it's really a fantastic and interesting story about just like dealing with the suffering of life and communing with God even in the bad things,
Yeah.
um, and taking joy actually in that, which is really hard to do. But that's where it's
Yeah.
like a little bit different than it's a little bit different than kind of like the stoic where I want to separate that stuff. Like it's almost like
Uh,
he's enjoying entering into the pain and the
mm,
communion that he gets with God through it. So it's a really
yeah.
fascinating paper. But
All right. Well, and then the only other thing is like before, if you can edit it, all this tech stuff. I don't know what we said at the beginning. I want to double check that.
oh yeah, yeah, I'll
Because if
definitely
we said, I just can't remember what we said. Some of the personal things, some of like detail, the personal stuff. I maybe
yeah.
want to.
What I can do is I can just like I'll just kind of cut into where you asked me if we're recording, and so we'll just and that way we'll make sure that
Oh,
everything
sure.
before that
That sounds good.
is yeah. That way we'll make sure everything before
Okay.
that's out. All right,
All
all
right.
right, man.
Sounds good. Well, this was a good time.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Okay. See you, man.
Talk to you later. Bye.